Dr. Pouya Alimagham is a historian of the modern Middle East. He specializes in Iran, Iraq, and the Levant in the 20th century, focusing on such themes as revolutionary guerrilla movements, imperialism, political Islam, and pan-Islamism. You write about your article, but I want to hear about what's the book title?
The book title, by the way, hello. It's a pleasure to be here. The book title is called Contesting the Iranian Revolution, The Green Uprisings.
Which is coming out from Cambridge University Press in the near future.
Yeah, we're indexing it right now, so you know.
We're indexing or you're indexing?
I'm having someone index it. I'm responsible for indexing, which is, you know, it's my first rodeo, so I'm learning as I go.
In Arabic, صاحب الدار أعلم بما فيها. The owner of the house knows best what's in the house. I suggest doing your own index. Okay, but this isn't the time to discuss that.
All right.
So he's going to speak to us, and he's got also, of course, his presentation. Now, remember, Georgetown's policy is, if you're in the room, you accept being recorded because the Q&A and everything's going to be recorded as well. So ask good questions. Thanks very much. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank Professor Jonathan Brown and Shirin as well, and the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. As a child, my brother and I always had a lot of affection for Georgetown, so it's a pleasure to be here. We were fans of the Hoyas. Essentially, basically what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be plugging in, by way of a presentation, my forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press. It's a very contentious topic. It's also pretty recent. It's on the uprising in 2009 in Iran. As is the case with most events in the Middle East, it can be polarizing, it can be contentious. So writing about something this recent has been interesting for me, to say the least. We're going to get into the background to this subversion of the banner of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, I think in about slide 10 or 11. I'm going to go for, I think, 45 minutes, I hope, and then I'll open it up to questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Again, thanks for being here. I know that for some of you, this may seem too basic to start here. I know a lot of you have a background on Iran, and political Islam, but not all of us are on the same page, so if you just will humor me, I'd like to basically talk really quickly about the government structure, the polity of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because this is where some of the problems stem. So, first of all, the system in Iran is a system of dual sovereignty. It's a system of dual sovereignty, meaning that sovereignty lies with the people by way of voting in the parliament and the presidential elections, but also in the divine, as manifest in Islamic law and some of the system's unelected bodies of power, such as the Guardian Council, the Supreme Leader, or the Supreme Leadership, and the judiciary. Most important here, most consequential here, is the head of state is not the president, but the Supreme Leader. Most consequentially, the Supreme Leader is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, right? Now, he appoints 6 of the 12 members of the Guardian Council, and then he appoints the head of the judiciary, and the head of the judiciary then appoints the other 6 members of the 12-member Guardian Council. The Guardian Council vets candidates who run for office for the presidency or for the parliament, and has veto power over legislation that they deem as contrary or contravening Islamic law. So it's a system that has democratic components to it, but highly controlled democratic components. The whole idea of the supreme jurisprudence, Velayat al-Faqih in Persian, Velayat al-Faqih in Arabic, however Islamic it is for sure distinctly Shiite Islamic as well. We're going to get into this, but the idea being that in the absence of the 12th Imam, the learned jurisprudent who is most in tune with the will of the 12th Imam, the 12th Shiite Imam, is most legitimate in terms of holding temporal power. As a way of background, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was president in 2009. He was seeking re-election. He was the incumbent. He was the first non-clerical president in Iran since Muhammad Ali Raja'i, who was killed in a bomb blast in '81. And he was facing opposition or facing election against Mir Hussein Mousavi, who was also a non-cleric. Today's president is Hassan Rouhani, and we hear them both in the news. We heard of him in the news a lot because of his crazy statements about the Holocaust. We hear Rouhani in the news more so because of the nuclear negotiations. Now, the Guardian Council, it's important, people think of it really as this mechanism of control for elections and the democratic components of the system by way of vetoing candidates that run for office for president or the parliament. But it also is a mechanism of control to ensure the independence of the country, meaning that if you are a candidate that is seeking office as a parliamentarian or as president, and you're receiving funding from abroad, then you won't be allowed to stand, right? You have to, this council basically, or at least uses the cover of ensuring that those candidates who seek office believe in the Constitution and are willing to defend it. So it is a mechanism of control, but also has an independence aspect to it too. And this, of course, is really important to Iran because of its history of the last 200 years of Western imperialism, most recently with the US overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953. Now, we're going to go through some timeline work with the elections in 2009, but history isn't really just about timelines. On this day, this happened. On that day, this happened. We're looking for themes. We're looking for ways to analyze it. What I did was I took Asif Bayat's theory of post-Islamism that he came out with in 2005, and I applied it to the Iranian theater of protest. And Montazeri would be our quintessential post-Islamist. Well, we'll get there too. So the idea being, what is post-Islamism? There's a theory of an Islamic state, right? Especially when it came to Shiite clerics and non-clerics who started basically theorizing in the 1960s and 70s as a way to counteract the idea that Islam was a dead letter. It was no longer relevant to the 20th century. They basically started theorizing that no, it is not only relevant, but it can be a state. And they started theorizing about that state. Muhammad Baqir Sadr in Iraq was probably one of the most, doesn't get that much credit because the system ultimately was founded in Iran, but he was one of the most important theorists. He basically wrote two books called Falsafatuna, Our Philosophy, and Iqtisaduna, Our Economy, to actually outline what an Islamic state would look like. Now, there's a theory of an Islamic state, and there's what it should look like when you implement it. And what ends up happening is that when you take something like a blueprint about the theory of a state and you go to erect that state like the Iranians did in 1979 onwards, you run into practical challenges. You end up making mistakes, a trial and error. And so what you see happen in Iran is you see a transition from a lot of the most ardent supporters of Iran's Islamic polity and even its co-architect, Montazeri, to becoming those who now seek to divorce religion from the state, not necessarily because they're anti-religion. Montazeri retained his, obviously his belief in Islam, and he, remained a cleric until his dying days, but he became one of the champions of the idea that I may have created this system, but now I believe that in order to save Islam, we have to separate it from the religion, separate it from the state. In more detail, the example would be citizenship, for instance, right? Under the Iranian monarchy pre-revolution, we had every Iranian was a citizen, but some were more citizen than others. It was more a system based on racial hierarchy. If you were an Aryan, for instance, or what Persians thought of themselves as Aryan, then you sat at the apex of that racial hierarchy. Of course, the symbolic figurehead of that racial hierarchy was Mohammad Reza Shah himself, the so-called light of the Aryans. The revolution changed all that. The revolution was no longer about an ethnic identity, but about a religious hierarchy. A head of state can be a non-Persian, but he can't be, but he has to be a Shiite Muslim. And not only does he have to be a Shiite Muslim, he has to be a cleric. And so then, if you were a religious minority, then that hierarchy might affect you, whereas before, religious minorities, at least politically, didn't suffer from persecution, or discrimination. And we had an Iranian Baha'i who was prime minister, who served as prime minister as the longest tenure, Amir Abbas Hoveyda. But after the revolution, the idea of religious identity became subject to that new religious hierarchy, and Baha'is were without real citizenship in Iran, and they still experience a lack of citizenship in Iran. What's interesting about Montazeri, in the context of 2009, is that he came out and said, look, I may be a cleric, and I think that the Baha'i faith is a heresy, he argued, but they are Iranian citizens nonetheless. And I, as one of the architects of the Islamic system, now argue that by virtue of the fact that they're Iranians, they deserve citizenship and equal rights. And this is what I mean when I say rights over duties, monopoly over religious truths, pluralism, not necessarily anti-religion, but that post-Islamist trend that we see that happen, or that those protests that happened in Iran in 2009, almost in a way was a manifestation of this post-Islamism. Now, if we go on to the actual happenings of what happened in 2009, it'll help us understand. So again, for those of you who have this background, I apologize. These are some basics, but bear with me. Just some, just some background. Ahmadinejad was the incumbent. Mousavi was the main challenger. In 2005, when Ahmadinejad was elected, there was more or less a boycott of the elections. After 8 years of reformist rule by way of Khatami, a lot of the youth in 2005 boycotted the election. The idea being that Khatami couldn't really reform the system. Everything he wanted to do was vetoed by the Guardian Council. Therefore, we're not going to really vote. The vote doesn't really mean anything. Khatami couldn't bring about systematic change, so what's the point of voting? And they largely boycotted. And as history could attest, and I think a lot of places, when the youth don't participate in elections, typically what ends up happening is a right-wing government comes to power. I think that was true of 2016 in the United States. It was certainly true in 2005 in Iran. When the youth boycotted, it helped bring Ahmadinejad to power. And then they realized that in the 4 years of the Ahmadinejad presidency, however undemocratic Iran's democratic institutions may be, having him at the helm had a material impact on their lives. A lot of social restrictions were hardened, the economy tanked, Iran was ostracized globally because of Ahmadinejad's more abrasive statements. So in 2009, there was that discussion of boycotting again, but it fell on deaf ears because of what happened in the previous 4 years. And on top of that, there was Iran's first adversarial one-on-one televised presidential debates. Iran had presidential television debates before, but in 2001, they were the first time they were one-on-one. And the fact that they were one-on-one created a more adversarial encounter. And Mousavi and Ahmadinejad, their debate was so acrimonious that they ended up saying a lot of stuff that maybe would have hurt the legitimacy of the system, but at the same time galvanized voters. All that stuff about corruption and dictatorship, or the lack of this or lack of that, oppression or social restrictions or sexism or institutionalized sexism, all that stuff came to the fore. And so people started, the youth in particular, got very excited about the elections. Now, in basic social movement theory, you can't just organize a protest movement in an authoritarian state. It's very difficult, right? But opportunities arise in certain moments. In 2009, the Iranian government really wanted people to participate in elections, right? By participating in a state-sanctioned election, you're in a way legitimating that system. You're participating in a state-sanctioned event, and they really wanted Iranians to participate. So all those social restrictions, especially restrictions on social media, were lessened to get people to have more means of communicating and expressing ideas and talking about these elections and getting excited about them. But another thing happened. It signaled to a lot of Iranians that something is different. Not only do we have access to Facebook and internet speeds are better, but things are just more open in general. So a lot of these campaigners mobilized for the election, but they mobilized to a certain extent that it almost looked like a protest movement. It turned into a street movement. And the IRGC, I think it was the Tehran commander, he basically came out and said that Mousavi is taking his campaign and turning it into a velvet revolution. And said that, unlike what happened in Ukraine, we will nip this revolution, we will nip this movement in the bud. So worried were they. This is about the elections. This is before any allegations of election fraud. This is before any protests or demonstrations. But it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because the election happened June 12th on a Friday. That night, the election results were announced. Of course, there was allegations of fraud. The next day was rioting. The next day, we had peaceful protests, especially the silent ones, especially after the government came down and called the protesters trash and hooligans. Then they started protesting, and they did so almost in total silence in certain parts. June 15th is the epic march in Tehran. That's the subject of the next slide. The following Friday, Khamenei doesn't normally give Friday sermons. He gives one or two a year, depending on the occasion. Definitely came out and gave one there. And basically said that the elections were legit. The government Guardian Council reviewed them, ratified them. Therefore, whatever happens, people have to accept the results. If protests continue, there will be a full-scale crackdown. There was a slight crackdown in that week, but after that, he said there will be a full crackdown. Whatever blood is shed is on the hands of those volunteers who are assuming that risk, those protesters, as well as on the leadership of the now opposition, Mousavi and Karoubi in particular. The crackdown began in full effect the 20th, and they were protesting every day, but after the 20th, they had to evolve their strategy. No longer, that opportunity to mobilize was no longer there anymore, because the security forces took full control of the streets. Right? This is basic timeline, but still it helps us understand the evolution of the protest movement after June 20th. Now, why post-Islamism is important is basically, it's important because in 1978 and 1979, the picture in the black and white, while political Islam didn't originate in Iran, it was the first time a country underwent an Islamic revolution, or what came to be an Islamic revolution. And it became a symptom of the times, right? And that's why you have this Orientalist Time magazine cover that came out in the same year of the Iranian Revolution that said, Islam, the militant revival. And it became, the Iranian Revolution became a sign of things to come in terms of political Islam and its mobilization and its growth and its spread. It didn't start with Iran, but Iran gave it a major boost transnationally. Now, post-Islamism is really interesting because it could potentially tell us what to expect going forth in terms of political Islam. If the Iranian Revolution told us that political Islam is a real thing and it has the potential to achieve state power, not just in Iran and elsewhere, then the uprising in 2009 could tell us what to expect when they achieve power, and how they may end up transitioning from that rigid system that they implement, for instance, in 1979, towards a more democratic system going forth. So yes, so this is the same square in Iran, Meydun Azadi, although in the revolution it was called something else. Today it's called Meydun Azadi, and this is 2 years before Tahrir and Taghir Square in Egypt and Yemen, and the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain. Like I said, it could represent a new trend. So what's really interesting about doing history that's pretty recent is that you have modern sources. And that's really good because sources that are, for instance, State Department sources or CIA sources, you have to wait theoretically 30 years to access them. But a lot of times the CIA really doesn't respect its own rules, and you don't get access to classified files for 50 or 60 years. But something like 2009, we don't really need to focus on classified documents, although a lot of those were leaked through WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, and we still access those, and those are very important. But it's recorded by the participants. Iran's uprising in 2009 was really the first modern or 21st century uprising, not in terms of time, but in terms of the stuff that it used, the means that it used to record it and convey it to the world. So this is footage from a pedestrian overpass in Tehran, and it shows you, I'll show you the clip, it's about a minute long. What's important about it is that Tehran's mayor at the time, Ghalibaf, said, it was actually posted online in a government news website that said 3 million Iranians came out in Tehran, And then that link was subsequently taken down. Because obviously it's a problem for the government to acknowledge that 3 million Iranian discontents or dissidents now had emerged to protest not just the election, but some were there also to protest the entire system. But they could take down what they want from the internet, but because this is a movement that, like I said, is very much a 21st century movement, we have 21st century technologies, and this is footage that a protester captured and posted it on YouTube. And now, no matter how many links go down, this will be there, unless this gets taken down too, but I have it recorded. The Iranian Revolution was the world's first televised revolution, right? But the Green Uprising was the world's first socially broadcasted revolt or revolution. So citizen journalism, right? When the post-uprising crackdown came into full effect, the Iranian government asked a lot of the journalists in the country, foreign journalists, the Iranian government invited them to leave. Another way of saying they got kicked out of the country. Fox News, CNN, BBC, all of them. But an idea being that we don't want international media to see this crackdown happen just because we want to have a free hand in cracking down. The more eyes that are on you, the harder it is to deny things and the less inclined you are to commit wholesale violence. But citizen journalism, everyone had a high-tech phone and were recording it themselves. Now, people give a lot of credit, we'll get into it in the next slide, people give a lot of credit towards Facebook and Twitter and all that. I think the important thing is that this footage was important in terms of broadcasting to the outside world, right? They learned how to decrease the size of the file. Most of the videos are very pixelated, right? Because the files have been decreased so they could be uploaded up to onto Dropbox, or so they could be emailed out of the country and supporters abroad could upload them onto YouTube. Facebook and Twitter, the role in 2011 was aggrandized in the Arab Spring. Was aggrandized again in 2009. The activists that I spoke with, and I very much believe this, that Facebook and Twitter were not that consequential to organizers and activists within the country. They were really important to conveying to a global audience what was happening, but not so much for coordination. But since we're talking about technology, it's still nonetheless technology plays a role, and there's a political genealogy of technology, especially when it comes to Iranian history of protest and contentious politics. The telegraph was very important to the constitutional revolution of the early 20th century, and before that, the tobacco revolt of 1890, 1892. The telephone was very important to the nationalist movement, Mossadegh's nationalist movement in the 50s. The cassette tape was very important to the Iranian Revolution. Less so Twitter and Facebook, but definitely SMS messaging. Very important into coordinating action to the uprising. Word of mouth was still really important. Basic word of mouth was very important. But technology still played a role in terms of conveying to the outside world what was happening and maybe even coordinating vis-a-vis text messaging. And of course today, a lot of attention is paid to Telegram. These these apps for smartphones that are encrypted and allow for not just messaging, but entire groups of thousands of tens of thousands of members, or maybe even larger.
Which has been filtered.
Which has been, of course, right? It's going to face that threat from the Iranian state because it's another mechanism that they do not control. So back to the slide 2 or 3 when we talked about how they were protesting every day, but then after Khamenei's security crackdown, full-scale security crackdown, the opposition evolved. They no longer had the opportunity to protest every day. So they had to evolve and protest on specific days, right? There are specific days in the Iranian calendar where the government wants protesters, not protesters, where the government wants people to come out and basically walk in step with the government. Like Jerusalem Day, a day that was founded by Khomeini and the Iranians in 1979. The National Struggle Against Global Arrogance Day. Who could tell me what that day is? Oh, who said that? Yes, exactly. It was the day of the Iranian seizure of the US Embassy. So these are days essentially where the government wants its supporters to come out and celebrate the government that champions the liberation of Palestine and Quds, or the government that resists global arrogance. But then what happened was the protesters, instead of coming out every day like they had been, evolved and came out on those days where the government wanted people to come out. But then they came out and more or less hijacked those days and subverted them. And came out, instead of saying death to America on November 4th, they were saying death to Russia, right? Because Russia was the first heads of state, Putin was the first head of state to welcome Ahmadinejad's election win. Or on Jerusalem Day, they came and said two things. There was one faction of the protesters that said, Na Gaza, na Lebanon, janam fadai Iran. Na Gaza, na Lebanon, my life is only for Iran. And the idea being that to negate Iran's claim of legitimacy for championing the Palestinians, they were saying no to Palestine and no to the Iranian government in a way. But then another strand within that same day of protest was saying, Madam chera neshastin, Iran shode Palestine. Oh people, why are you sitting when Iran has become Palestine? Meaning they used this discourse of the state against the very state. By meaning they said, if the Iranian government has taught us for 30 years that Palestine is this oppressed nation usurped by the Israelis, and the Israelis are occupiers and they're bad, then on Jerusalem Day, of all days, we are now equating the Iranian government with the Israelis. They too are usurpers of power, and we are akin to the Palestinians, and we too are oppressed, right? So they use the state-sanctioned discourse against that very state. And they did it on all days, the most important of which is Ashura, right? Ashura we're going to get to in a second, subsequent slides. But Ashura being the, obviously the anniversary of the 7th century the 7th century martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the third Shiite, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad and the third Shiite Imam. That is the activist-made image on the right. It shows the days of action in Persian. And the idea being that by the time it reaches Revolution Day, Bisto Bahman, in February, the regime will come crumbling down. Of course, that is not what happened. But back to Ashura. So again, for those of you who have a strong background or even a basic background, I apologize for starting with the basics. But just for backdrop, there are 12 direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. For Shiite Muslims, the minority sect in Islam, and these 12 are infallible, and they are the rightful heirs to the spiritual and political leadership of the Muslim community. The third Shiite Imam, long story short, rose up against what Shiites believe was a usurpation of the caliphate, the leadership of the Muslims, the successorship of the Prophet Muhammad. And he died a martyr's death in what is today Iraq, in Karbala. It's typically a day of mourning. We just had it recently, maybe like 10 days ago, all across the world, but especially in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, and Bahrain. Now, typically Ashura is a day of mourning and self-reflection and maybe even some cleansing. But it's definitely a day of mourning, right? For much of the 20th century, Ashura was commemorated simply as a day of mourning, right? But then we see across the region, part of that move towards making Islam more applicable to the modern world, more relevant, because the Marxist critique of Islam was that, oh, Islam always focuses on the afterlife or talks about an Islamic state as bringing heaven on earth, but you know, we Marxists have the plan for how to create a socially just system. Islam just talks about these things. It's not really relevant. You know, religion is dead. And so you see in the 50s and 60s and 70s, theorists like Shariati and Khomeini and Baqir Sadr and Imam Musa Sadr in terms of the Shiite school, coming out and theorizing a Shiism that is applicable. And one of the ways they did it was they reinterpreted Imam Hussein's martyrdom to mean that, yes, he did die a martyr's death, but if you believe in Imam Hussein, and if you believe in his martyrdom, you shouldn't simply mourn his death, right? If you really, truly believe in him, then you have to enliven what he died for. And he died fighting, resisting tyranny and power, and injustice and oppression. Therefore, if you want to be like Imam Hussein, if you want to mourn him, you should mourn him by fighting today's injustices, today's oppressions, right? So you see across Lebanon, and in terms of the Shiite community, Iraq and Iran, this political mobilization that uses kind of discourse, right? Ashura of 1978 in Iran basically helped bring the Iranian revolution to a crescendo. This is at a time of martial law, military government. The government was really trying to fight tooth and nail this revolutionary uprising, and it implemented a military curfew on the country. But Ashura ultimately became the largest protest event in Iranian history for sure. But until that point, according to University of Virginia professor Charles Kurzman, maybe in world history, about 17 million people, almost half the population, mobilized for revolution. And what became a referendum. Of course, there was no ballots, they voted with their feet, but a referendum on the monarchy. Khomeini called this revolution Nehzat Hosseini, the Hosseini movement, obviously invoking Imam Hussein. Now, why this is important to 2009 is because there's a paradox. Hussein never achieved power. He died fighting power, right? To call this movement, to call the Iranian Revolution Nehzat Hosseini, it kind of harkens into a paradox, meaning that the Iranian government internationally doesn't really have a paradox. It is the powerless entity fighting global powers, specifically the United States. It's that underdog role that Imam Hussein played. But nationally, the Iranian government that rests its legitimacy on the 12 Imams is the ultimate power holder in the country. So nationally, there's a paradox. Internationally, not so much. Internationally, we see this paradox. We see this lack of a paradox internationally with the establishment of Hezbollah. This is a pamphlet that was distributed in 1985. Hezbollah was in the making since '82, but it formally crystallized in 1985 with the publication of this manifesto. This is also in the context of the Lebanese Civil War and the Israeli invasion of the country. This manifesto, I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but if you see the part that's in bold, it says, "From here, what befalls the Muslims in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Philippines, or anywhere else, verily afflicts the body of our Islamic nation, of which we are an inseparable part. And we move to confront it on the basis of our main legal obligation and in light of a political view decided by our leader, the Walat al-Faqih." And the idea being that now Khomeini and Islamic Iran, or Islamist Iran, were leading the so-called vanguard of the Muslim world, leading the resistance, the Hosseini resistance against power and oppression, resisting the Israelis, resisting the Soviet Union, resisting the Americans. This is how they enlivened it, and this is why there's no contradiction or paradox when we talk about it in an international sphere. And you see that in this billboard, or I don't even know what to call it, this building-sized mural, I guess, where they liken President Obama, this is before the nuclear agreement, they liken President Obama to Shimmer, the captain on the field who ended up basically ordering the beheading of the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. So again, internationally, you see this visualized on this building. Nationally, there's that paradox. Now, for our purposes, what's important is that on Ashura 2009, this paradox was sharpened and brought to the fore. Protesters again came out 6 months after the election results in December 27th, 2009, and they likened themselves to Hussein's band of rebels, righteous band of rebels, against what they considered the Yazid of Iran, right? Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the country. So one slogan we saw throughout the uprising was Ya Hussein, Mir Hussein. that situated the now opposition leader's name alongside Imam Hussein. But on this day, it obviously had a different kind of meaning. But then they said, on Muharram, on Ashura, the holy month of Muharram, and Ashura being the 10th day of Muharram, the day Imam Hussein was martyred, they said, این ماه خون است سید علی سرنگون است این ماه خون است Yazid سرنگون است. This is the month of blood, Yazid will be overthrown. This is the month of blood, Sayyid Ali Khamenei will be overthrown. So problematic was this for the Iranian government that to be equated for the embodiment of Hussein's resistance globally, the Iranian government, to now be equated with the murders of Imam Hussein at the hands of unarmed protesters was the gravest sin of the tallest order. And so the government really, those protesters that were captured on that day, many of them received death sentences. The government was much harsher with protesters on that day than any other day, and there was more people that died on that day than any other day of action in the history of the uprising. Having said that, the government was really tried its best, not because it's humane or anything like that, to not produce martyrs for the opposition. So all in all, our sources tell us that about 120 demonstrators were killed in the 6-month uprising. 120 versus the 800 that were killed just in the 3 weeks of the Egyptian revolt in 2011. The idea being was that not that the Iranian government is more humane than the Egyptian government, because martyrs, it didn't want to produce martyrs because martyrs are important to galvanizing opposition. Martyrs in the Iranian Revolution, when they died on the 40th day of mourning for their death, there was another protest and more people died on that day. And then those martyrs had their 40th day of mourning. 3 of these mourning cycles brought the revolution to a crescendo in 1978. We are almost done, so hang in there if you can, please. So this is the banner of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Iran. The Revolutionary Guards co-founded Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you see its influence in the configuration of Hezbollah's banner in the yellow. The Revolutionary Guards not only co-founded, but founded the Badr Brigade in Iraq. You see again the configuration of, or the impact that the Revolutionary Guards had on the Badr Brigade, the militia in Iraq that was very consequential post-Saddam. All the way to the right, you see how not only through hijacking days of action important to the Iranian government, not only inverting all the Iranian government's symbolism, but even the iconic logo of the Revolutionary Guards was inverted or subverted. So it says here, what's that? بسیج سپاه قلم سبز واحد مقاومت چی؟ Online. It's much smaller here. So this is they use the word Basij itself, a very interesting term, because Basij is the name of the paramilitary force in Iran, the hardline paramilitary force, and this is the mobilized online unit of the green resistance, essentially. Now, people love to talk about technology empowering dissent. It can also empower repression. Gerdab, a news source tied to the IRGC, ended up posting 28 photos of protesters on Ashura, and asked state supporters to come and help identify so-called rioters. And of course, several hundred were arrested. This was an ominous sign of things to come. This is way before the Russian hack of the 2016 elections and Facebook and all that. This was 2009. This was something that I was chronicling as it was happening, and I remember reading an article by Anna Marie Cox at The Guardian that essentially said that, this is Edward Snowden, but she said that governments may be able to influence the way we think, right? And we see that very much so in 2016 with the Russian hack of Facebook and how it influenced our elections, but 2009 was essentially the precursor to all that. And of course, Edward Snowden revealed that he was able to basically hack into our phones and see real time as we were typing and deleting words and going back and figuring out sentences. He could see that stuff real time, and government hackers can turn on your mics even if your phone is off. And that should all tell you that Iran was not something unique to over there, but it's a problem. Technology is a problem if it's in the wrong hands, for sure. History can be non-linear. Most people talk about the Green Uprising as a failure. I would definitely push back about that. It's a failure only if you think in a binary. Oh, so they were unable to abrogate the election results, therefore they failed. No, they succeeded in so many different ways. History can be nonlinear. In 1963, Khomeini led an uprising against the Shah's government. It was a failure. A lot of people died. He was exiled, but it wasn't over. First of all, Khomeini obviously came back 15 years later and led a revolution. But also, there was students, religious and not religious, who saw peaceful protesters killed en masse by the Iranian government, and that radicalized them. And many of them went on to create the Mujahideen Khalq and the Fadayan Khalq, two radical guerrilla organizations that in the 70s waged a guerrilla war against the Shah's government. So it's only over, what happened in 2009 is only over if we think of it as a straight line and as a binary. Otherwise, there's been so many moments that Iranians themselves have reminded us that it's not over. When the Arab Spring happened, Mousavi and Karabi called for protests and solidarity with their neighbors. Of course, it wasn't about solidarity, but it was not only about solidarity, but it was also about using the momentum of the Arab Spring to reignite the protest movement in Iran. And one of the slogans was, Mubarak ben Ali, Nobat Sayyid Ali. Mubarak fell, Ben Ali fell, now it's the turn of Sayyid Ali Khamenei to fall. And when Rouhani was elected, when the Iran nuclear accord happened, and celebrations of when Mohammad Jawad Zarif came back to Iran, Rouhani's re-election, Rafsanjani's funeral, when people gathered, you always heard slogans that harkened back to the Green Movement. So I wouldn't say that it's over. In fact, 3 of the protest leaders are still in house arrest, and there's always rumors that they're going to be released, but they are still under house arrest since 2011. And the recent protests, in December 2017 and January and so on in 2018, it's not about the election results. But there is a genealogy there. There is a connection because, first of all, some of the slogans that were popularized in the Green Movement in 2009 are being rehashed today. No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life is only for Iran. And independence, freedom, Iranian government. Istiqlal, Azadi, Jomhuri, Irani, which is a play on the Iranian government's slogan, Istiqlal, Azadi, Jomhuri, Islami. Independence, freedom, Islamic government has now been inverted in 2009 and again now to independence, freedom, and Iranian republic. And of course, the election and the crackdown changed everything. When the crisis first happened in June, the slogan was, "Where's my vote?" That's the slogan they had. "Where's my vote?" And they had, they held signs that said so. By December, everything had changed. The crackdown had hardened demonstrators, and it was no longer about Ahmadinejad, but about the entire system in Iran and its figurehead, Khamenei. So the slogan went from "Where's my vote?" to "Khamenei is a murderer, his authority is void." Khamenei qatele velayatish batele. And so it took 6 months for the Iranians, the protesters, to go from "Where's my vote?" to such radical slogans. In 2017, even though it was more economic protests in Iran, it didn't take them 6 months. They picked up more or less when the Green Movement left off, when they said, Khamenei bedune bezudi sarnegune. Khamenei should know he will be overthrown soon. Right? So you see that continuity. Closing thoughts. Shiite Islam can be a discourse for the state if that state is a resistance state, as the Iranian government styles itself vis-a-vis Israel and the United States. But it's also a discourse of resistance, period. It doesn't belong to the state. It succeeds upon failure and fails upon success, right? Shiism never held power, especially Imam Hussein. He was triumphant. He was morally triumphant upon his failure. But then Shiism of Hussein fails upon success after it attains power. So there's this whole post-Islamism that's unfolding in Iran. If it does have a chance to fully unfold without it being subverted, it could be a precursor of what to expect. If the Iranian Revolution was a precursor of what to expect in the 40 years that have transpired in the wider Muslim world since the Iranian Revolution, then what's happening now in terms of post-Islamism and that transition could be a sign of things to come for the region and for the Muslim world, just like the way it was in the 1978-79. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So the Iranian government presented the protesters as lacking agency, as being part of a Western conspiracy. And you know, it was very easy for them to make that argument because, especially under the Bush administration, the Bush Jr., there was a concerted effort to overthrow the system, right? And so it made it easier for the government to cast those protesters as agents of imperialism, even though they weren't. And so a lot of Iranians, the reason why it was 3 million in Tehran and not 12 million in Tehran was because there was still a lot of people that supported the system, and there's a lot of people that bought into that argument, but there's also a lot of fence-sitters, right? There's a cost-benefit calculation that goes into play when someone thinks about participating in an uprising that could be very hazardous. And so, you know, it depends on who you talk to, but I think that, not to be partisan, but President Obama initially didn't say anything about the election results. And I thought that was really strategic and really brilliant, because the United States has a history of subversion in Iran, from overthrowing the Iranian government to trying to support separatist movements under the Bush administration to always the threat of war. And so for Obama to come out forcefully on the side of the protesters in 2009, which he didn't, it would have made it easier for the government to paint this movement as part of a US conspiracy. And so the fact that he didn't, a lot of Iranians in the diaspora were really upset about it. They're like, he should take a firm stand. I'm like, you guys aren't thinking strategically. The fact that he didn't made it harder for the government to cast it, but still, the government was casting it as a conspiracy from outside because of this history of U.S. subversion. Yeah.
Question.
Please.
You didn't mention the Al-Qasim, her death shown on TV.
Yeah, so this is a big part of my book, right? The fact that, first of all, Neda Agha Sultan, she died in that post-Khamenei sermon crackdown, right? It became the most televised death in world history, in a way. It was broadcast all across the world, right? It was captured by camera, it was posted on YouTube. No official BBC news person, no one like that captured it. It was citizen journalism at its best. The fact that it was a woman that became the poster girl of this uprising is also telling, right? Women were very active, and they have long been active for the past 100 years, especially from the Constitutional Revolution all the way up to here. So when we think of Neda Agha Sultan, it's important to think about her as not only a symptom or a sign of the brutality of the state, but also what she represented. The other thing is that while it galvanized international support for the protest, now they had a face they could identify with. It also actually, in a way, harmed the protest movement, because so horrific and brutal was her death that a lot of parents that were sympathetic towards this uprising, they had been involved in uprising themselves when they were at that age, 30 years prior. They saw what happened to her, and they fought harder to prevent their sons and daughters, especially their daughters, because she was a daughter, prevent them from joining or continuing to be involved. And that's why you see the numbers dropping off as the protest movement continued, dropping off and hardening. Those who came out were the more radical ones, the more committed ones. The scale of the crackdown had changed them, and the slogans changed from "Where's my vote" to the more radical ones.
In 1999, the Tehran University crackdown grew. Khamenei did nothing. He was the president.
Khatami. Yeah, these names are tricky. Yeah, so that was one of the things. Khatami, the fact that he had to play this balancing act, rubbed a lot of the students the wrong way. Like, we're protesting against the system that you are more or less opposing from within, and all you have to say to us is national security and this and that, and people should be more peaceful and stuff like that. And so a lot of these protesters in that 1 week of protest that was largely confined to Tehran, this is nationwide. Khatami one after another, and that's ultimately why they boycotted in 2005, was because he became ineffectual. And 1999 was a milestone in that trend. Thank you.
What do you see happening? Maybe you think the government of the U.S. can see
What do I see happening, and then what?
I mean, the Islamic government in Iran will come in.
Well, so when I talk about post-Islamism, and if we allow things to happen organically, then anything is possible. The moment there's a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, or the moment there's an invasion, or the moment there's sanctions or attack in Ahvaz, the moment the flag comes out, the more people close ranks, the more the government casts its internal challenges as part of a ISIS plot or an American plot. So if you would like to see a different kind of Iran, then I would hope that you would want to see less intervention, because intervention is a spoiler to those trends, and it has been historically. The U.S. overthrew the Iranian government, put Iran back decades. When the revolution happened and the clerics were consolidating power, Saddam Hussein invaded. When Saddam Hussein invaded, anyone who opposed the clerical consolidation of power was cast as siding with the Iraqi invader. And they used that war to legitimate their own consolidation of power. So what happens abroad impacts the domestic very easily, right? So for me, as someone who lives in the United States, as an Iranian who lives in the United States, and this is a labor of love, this book is 350 pages. I'm very sympathetic, obviously. All our books are, everyone who writes a book, it's in a way autobiographical. I'm very sympathetic towards this uprising, but I understand the dangers posed to it from abroad. And so I'm very cautious about that U.S. role intervention, for certain. You had it many times.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about, you mentioned that some of the slogans became more radical over time.
Mhm.
And when you talk about post-Islamism, did you see in those slogans or in the ideas of some people that they were just attacking the supreme leader, or were they criticizing the concept of legislature and the general structure of the state as well?
So when you criticize Khamenei, you're criticizing the system. He is the figurehead of the entire system. The heart of the Iranian system is the Velayat Faqih, is Khamenei, right? He's theoretically above the politics of the state, right? He's supposed to be theoretically above the politics. When he came out and endorsed Ahmadinejad, what's supposed to be typically a forward move position of guidance, but ultimately its power is concentrated because he controls the armed forces. When he came down as forcefully as he did on Ahmadinejad, he in a way opened himself up to attack and the entire system. If he hadn't gotten involved, the focus would have been on Ahmadinejad. But he more or less compromised the system. But the slogans, I'm trying to think if there's actual slogans about Velayat Faqih. When they say Velayatish Batele, Khamenei Qatele, Velayatish Batele, when they say Khamenei is a murderer, his Velayat is Batel, I mean, you're not really just talking about Khamenei. You know what I mean? You can't never just talk about Khamenei. He's a poster boy of the system. If Neda Agha Sultan is a poster girl of the uprising, Khamenei is a poster boy of the system. Yes?
Yes, hi, thank you. That was fascinating. I actually was in Iran during the protest. I think June 13th was when I got there.
Wow.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing it from an American perspective. My question to you is, what happens when Khamenei dies? Like, he's 79.
He had prostate surgery a few years ago too.
Yeah, he's very healthy for as old as he is.
Well, because they have all these resources, right? These dictators, they stay forever, right? You know what I mean? They just never don't. But what's going to happen when that's a big conversation. It's really, I'm a historian. Historians should not be predicting things, right? So many historians, not historians, but so many people try to predict. If Iranian history has taught us anything, one is that the Iranian people have agency. Like as much as the Iranians who oppose the Iranian revolution now live in the diaspora, like to say that those Iranians who opposed the Shah were part of a British conspiracy, and now the Iranian government says those who oppose us in 2009 are now part of an American conspiracy. What we learn is that Iranians have agency. They are calculating. They are rational, right? That's one lesson. The other lesson is that you shouldn't predict history. You shouldn't predict what's going to happen. This whole region, these big cataclysmic events that have happened, none of us could see what was going to happen. When ISIS took Mosul in 2014, it was a shock to all of us. You know what I mean? When those Arab governments collapsed at the hands of their uprisings, when the Iranian uprising was much longer, and the attack on the Iranian government was much more comprehensive. I mean, Egypt had more numbers. This had numbers too. The Egyptian uprising had more numbers, but its attack wasn't as hard-hitting from a theoretical perspective, not nearly as hard. They didn't talk about the constitution. They didn't talk about the system. They talked about Mubarak, right? The attack the Iranian protesters made on the Iranian government was total. And the Iranian government didn't budge in an inch, whereas all those other systems collapsed. So it's really hard to predict. One thing I will say, this is going to be hard for a lot of people to hear, is that the Iranian government, there's mass discontent in Iran, but it still enjoys support. And it enjoys rock solid support from certain segments of the population. And those certain segments are not 5,000, 10,000 people, right? The Iranian government has support of many more people than the Iraqi government ever did. Please.
Now, this last round of uprising in early 2018, late 2017,
Mm-hmm.
there's an interesting slogan that you didn't mention, which was Islah Talab Usul Gad Gitaun Maja, which means reformist and fundamentalist, the game is over.
Yeah.
And I think it suggests that the people, the majority of Iranians think that the reformist movement is a spent force and
Yeah.
bankrupt ideas. So how do you think that they're going to respond to them when Rouhani's second term is over and they have another presidential election? Will they
Boycott?
stay home, or they just say, if they put up another reformist candidate, that people go to the polls?
So Rouhani is not a reformist,
No, I
right?
know,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
he kind of during
He's
the
essentially-
election campaign, he kind of paints himself as
Yeah, and then the color of he had a color too now.
Right.
His color was purple. And then one of the slogans, well, I forgot the slogan, but it basically said like purple or green, it's all the same movement, right? So they lashed themselves onto the green movement and the reformist movement. But you know, that was another victory of the green movement, was that the Iranian government had to let somebody like Rouhani run because they knew no one was going to vote if there was nobody that they could. So will they now?
sit on.
I don't. To be honest, if they could remember, because Americans have very short-term memory. Iranians may have short-term memory too. I don't know. If people think that voting is not going to change much, and then they just let a right-wing government come to power, then they're going to remember what they remembered after Ahmadinejad came to power and it had a difference in their lives. So it depends. Even if Rouhani can't change things that systematically, I don't even know if he wants to. Even if he can't, if they could remember what happened in 2005 with Ahmadinejad, and if there's a candidate that is palpable to them, that could, not palpable, but that they could basically get behind nominally, then they may vote. But still, however controlled the electoral process is in Iran, more of the electorate, a larger percentage votes than in the United States, which is really interesting. Yes, please.
Does the Green Movement, as you're describing it, does the Green Movement have an Islamically defined alternative to the system that is opposing, or is it basically an opposition movement?
Yeah, I would say opposition movement. But see, here's the thing. Zahra Rahnavar.
So is there an Islamic alternative being presented by anybody?
So, well, it depends on what we mean by alternative, right? So there's a whole idea of like, you know, Abdul Karim Soroush is one of the main theorists, right?
Soroush has been here.
Yeah, so Soroush is interesting because he was part of that cultural revolution in the 80s. He was part of the whole Islamizing that very rigid worldview of the early 80s of the government. And now he's all about religious pluralism and all that. I don't know if that's an alternative or maybe a variation of the more rigid system that's in power today. But it's, the point really is that we can't really, and I go through this in my book, it's really difficult to talk about the Green Movement as a monolith, right? Zahra Rahnavard, one of the more iconic figures of the movement, basically says the Green Movement is an umbrella. She uses the word umbrella. It's an umbrella for a lot of different movements. Women's movement, youth movement, minorities, religious minorities, other oppressed peoples within the country. And they all could agree that there's something inherently wrong with the system. There's something inherently wrong with Iran. And they have gathered under this umbrella to protest. And the only way we could really discern like Mousavi put out a charter, right? But that charter it's very much written by the Prime Minister Imam Khomeini. Like they call him Imam's Prime Minister because he was the Prime Minister of Khomeini. Because Khomeini's Prime Minister in the 80s, right? So the charter, you could very much say he's still loyal to the system. He doesn't want to radically change it. And his charter, in my opinion, does not reflect a multifaceted movement. It reflects him and his history and his, being part of the architects who built the system, who want to save it, want to change it, but to save it nonetheless. So my answer would be that it's hard to give an answer because it's not a monolith. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, sir. You have explained a lot about the political regime in Iran, but how do you classify this regime? Is it like autocratic regime, a religious autocratic, or anocratic regime? I don't know exactly how do you classify it, because political theory just give us some options to classify political regimes.
Yeah.
So in Egypt you can say this regime is that or this, but in Iran I don't understand. I have.
But that's great. The fact that you don't understand is actually great, right? It's telling, because that's the confusion, right? So they call it a religious democracy, an Islamic democracy. That's what the Iranian government calls it, right? But so much of the power vested in the state is in anti-democratic institutions that lord over the few democratic institutions that exist, right? The democratic institutions are very narrow, right? And if you zoom back, it's this is the context of the Cold War, was the system was born, right? So it's like the third way. If the whole world is going between East and West, then this is a whole new system that challenges that whole global paradigm. If I were to classify it,
Why don't you call it theocracy? It's a theocracy.
yeah, but the theocracy doesn't capture the democratic components to it. It doesn't.
Just a facade. That is a facade that we want to
The democratic institutions, I readily say they're highly controlled, but they're very important. Very important.
legitimacy to the system and not to
But look at the region, though, right? Like, the Saudis don't even give the courtesy of a staged election, the courtesy of a controlled or a fraudulent election, right? So that's not my way of legitimating the system, not at all. And I hope you end up reading the book. I really do, right? Because it's something I would labor to write, and I wonder if anyone's going to read it. No one reads books anymore. It's weird. And so, if I were to use the word theocracy, it's just, using that word, it undermines the democratic components within the system, and those democratic components are very important to the populace. They vote, they protest for it, they give their lives for it, and they're constantly trying to push to democratize the system more from within those institutions. So I understand the desire to call it a theocracy, but it doesn't capture the whole. Maybe a democracy with a highly controlled democratic component to it, right? You don't have a term for it. You have to explain with some nuance. Please.
My generation thought about the revolution in Iran. I remember most of my friends were saying that the Shah's family was plundering other countries' resources. So now that Iran is spending so much of its resources, Lebanon,
Syria.
Syria, what do Iranians think, especially about Syria? Is that causing any kind of is concern for the government? Is there enough ideas?
So we know.
Talks about that because people are suffering, right? There's not enough money.
So we know that the protests in 2017 and 18 brought up that issue. They brought up Syria, like Machi, right? You also see that in 2009 when they talked about Palestine, right? So when they said no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life is only for Iran, then if you read what they actually wrote to explain, so there was that slogan on the streets. Then afterwards, a lot of activists wrote articles explaining. And one of the points they made was that we're sick and tired of hearing about this because it's almost like the Palestinians are being prioritized over us. Like they're getting resources when we don't, right? And this is 2009, right? And Iran has spent a lot more in Syria. And it's still sending money in Palestine too, right? The only thing I would say is that these protests are very important. They give us a window onto some trends within the country, but they still really, you can't say that they represent the entire country, right? These protests, even in 2009, even though there were so many people just in Tehran, 3 million people, 3 million versus the 12 or 15 million that live in the capital, right? So we shouldn't paint a broad brush, right? What's really interesting about 2018 though is that Syria also became a hashtag. saying that some Iranians within the country and abroad were so worried about these protests because of the timing of them. This is, you know, a very sensitive time because of the wars, because of ISIS, because of Trump. And so they're saying, you know, don't protest right now. Right? There's never really a good time to protest, right? You just protest because you have to, right? You don't schedule these things. And so one of those hashtags that was trying to discourage protesters was, we will become like Syria. Like we will implode from within. And then another hashtag that was like, no, trying to encourage protesters was, we will become like Tunisia. So it's really interesting. Syria, one way or another, is involved, you know, in this discourse.
So do you think Iran is in Syria because of Israel, or why are they? Why are they spending so much money and also so many soldiers dying? Why are they?
Yeah.
I
So
don't understand
the
as much as I feel about it.
sure. The Western perspective is that the Iranians are there out of Shiite solidarity. That's not it at all. Yeah, the Syrian government is anything but Shiite, right? They don't identify with Shiite, and they're not even religious to begin with. Iran is there because it goes back to the Iran-Iraq War, right? The Iran-Iraq War was something that you all remember. It was a very traumatic experience for Iran and the leadership. Like Ahmadinejad fought in the war. His cabinet were IRGC commanders. Majority of his cabinet were commanders and veterans of that war. Qasem Soleimani is one of the most powerful men in Iran. You also fought in that war. And so in that war, when Western Germany, at the time there was Western Germany, the Soviet Union, all Arab governments except for Libya to a lesser extent, but definitely in Syria, the French, the British, all of them backed Saddam's war machine. So much so that when Saddam used chemical weapons on Iranian troops and Iran went to the UN to protest, the United States scuttled any attempt at Iran getting redress at the UN. That's how much the world was aligned with Iraq. The same Iraq that the United States ultimately went to war with over weapons of mass destruction. Syria was the only country that really didn't side with Iraq. So it's about wartime allies and also making sure that Iran maintains a land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Its biggest foreign policy success is Hezbollah. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, last question, yes.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of observations that I'd like you to comment on. When I look at Iran, I see a country where there are a lot of competing power centers.
Mm-hmm.
The Majlis, the presidency, you know, all
The Revolutionary Guards.
all these,
Yeah.
exactly, the bazaar, the businessmen, and so on. It's an extremely stable situation. They have elections every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Very often you can't predict who's going to
Mm-hmm.
win. They're essentially term limited to 2 terms,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. These protests are a sign of dissatisfaction,
Mhm.
obviously, but somehow the system is able to integrate them and deal with them, and sometimes it results in a guy like Khatami, and sometimes in a guy like Rouhani, and sometimes you get an Ahmadinejad. We
Mhm.
have a president who's somewhat unusual, out of the norm. So, I mean, these are signs of strength, it seems to me, rather than the system that's teetering. So, does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I don't know. So there's this general assumption in the United States that the regime is teetering, right? I don't think so. Even when the uprising happened in 2009, I do think the government has legitimacy issues, especially because of what happened in 2009 and how comprehensive the attack 2009 was on all the symbols of legitimation for the Iranian government. But it's not like the Shah's regime. Historians love to talk about the Shah's regime as a one-bullet solution. The Iranian system is much more entrenched. It is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It has a lot of structure and infrastructure throughout the country. Whether we could call it stable or not, it's predictable. But elections and all that stuff, centers of power and authority and multiple layers of security that the Shah's government never really had or enjoyed. But there is a convergence of anti-Iranian government forces that are happening right now that are pushing and pressuring Iran, unlike anything I've ever seen in the past 20 years.
Anti-Iranian forces.
Anti-Iranian government forces, yeah. So the fact that the Mujahideen Khalq, that organization, very organized, bankrolled by the Saudis, the fact that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Mujahideen, and all their lobbying, and the Israelis and the Trump administration all have a common goal of imploding the system at a time where the Iranian economy is suffering, even though it more or less surrendered its nuclear program, gives a lot of people hope that the system is teetering, right? And that's why you kind of see that sentiment in the United States. And there's protests in Iran too, right? And protests, they're not like here, right? Over here, when protests happen, we're not really talking about regimes falling or anything like that, right? And Iran protests happening when there's all these forces aligned against the government, international forces, gives those protesters added strength, like vis-a-vis the state. So I personally, I'm a historian, I don't want to make a prediction. All I would say is that the government is under pressure unlike any time I've seen in the last 20 years. Nothing compared to the early 80s and the war and the hostage crisis and the pressure that everyone was putting on Iran and backing Iraq. This pressure that Iran is dealing with pales in comparison to the 80s pressure. But in the last 20 years, it's unprecedented.
And yet they're doing very well in the region.
So they're very good. They're very good at marshaling support and organizing. They're what's called a guerrilla state, right? They're seasoned when it comes to exerting power and influence across the region, right? They're not as efficient domestically. Yeah.
So, everybody, let's help out our presenter by reading the book so that his fear doesn't manifest. I'm certainly going to read it.
All right.
Dr. Pouya Alimagham, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.